deportation of ethnic Koreans to Central Asia, 8 years of survival and prospering through the ordeal. Victoria did 2 master's degrees, one degree in Korean studies from Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C., and another one at University of Bolton in UK in journalism. She's originally from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and presently stationed in Beijing, doing an individual research as well as a storyteller. Her story on Korean diaspora in Russia has been published in various media, also presented to a variety of audience at University of Washington, Georgetown University, as well as Johns Hopkins and other institutions. She is also author of Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story. So without further ado, let's welcome Victoria with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy and honored to be here today. And I want to give special thank you to the Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch, to Brother Anthony and Dr. Jiang for having me here. And thank you all today for coming. And I see a lot of familiar faces here, which is amazing. And it's an honor to speak in front of such a distinguished audience today. So I wanted to ask you, before starting our today's conversation, which I would actually like to call the night of Koryo-Saram, the Korean people of Central Asia and Russia, Posyet Koreans. So before starting our conversation in this talk and lecture, I actually wanted to ask all of you. Yeah? Like this? Yeah? Okay. Is it better? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Perfect. So I wanted to ask all of you, before starting, how many of you are familiar with Central Asia? With Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, former Soviet Union? Can you please raise your hand? Okay, great. So I can see that our audience is very knowledgeable. And how many of you have heard about the ethnic Korean diasporas? Perfect. So that's great to have you all here. And let me tell you at the beginning that it's very symbolical for me to have this talk here in Seoul, talking about ethnic Koreans from Central Asia and Russia, from the former Soviet Union. I had these talks in China, in Beijing, and as you might know, probably that China is actually home to the biggest, to the largest overseas diaspora of ethnic Koreans. Over 2.5 million ethnic Koreans live in China. I also spoke about this topic in the US, the home to the second largest Korean diaspora abroad, over 2.3 million people. I haven't done this talk in Japan yet, where about 800 million ethnic Koreans live. But what I want to tell you is that our Korean diaspora, Koryo-Saram as they call themselves, ethnic Koreans from the former Soviet Union, from Russia and Central Asia, or Koryo-in as they are known here in South Korea. Altogether, this is a diaspora of over 500,000 people. So it holds the 4th place in the world as the 4th largest overseas Korean diaspora. And still, compared to other diasporas, as I mentioned, in China, in the United States, in Japan and in Canada, this diaspora is still relatively not so well known and stays kind of mysterious Korean diaspora. Let me show you some faces of ethnic Koreans in Uzbekistan. These photos I took for my project, Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story. As you can see, they are all ethnic Koreans. So this Korean girl with her Uzbek boyfriend. And here we have ethnic Korean sellers in a typical market in Uzbekistan. I don't know how many of you have been to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and Russia, but if you have been, you might have noticed probably that local Korean stands with Korean food are as normal to see in our countries as any other sellers in the market. And Korean food actually became part of our national cuisine in each country, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, in Russia and the rest of Central Asia. And here you can see the local Korean community. This is the celebration of Solal, or Lunar New Year. Earlier this year, I took this picture in Uzbekistan on one of the former collective farms where all ethnic Koreans who resettled to Uzbekistan had to work and lived. So on one of the former collective farms, ethnic Koreans still gather together and celebrate Solal, the Lunar New Year. This is the only ethnic diaspora in my home country, Uzbekistan, which celebrates typical Korean holidays, but with a local flair, as you can see, because this is a Korean celebration, but the table is local and laid lavishly in the Central Asian, Russian or Post-Soviet tradition. And you can see that our Koreans, they strive to keep the Korean culture. Here they are wearing local national Korean outfit or hanbok, provided now by South Korea. But the first hanboks, or the first Korean national dress, was actually brought to our Koreans at the end of 1980s by North Korea, which is also a very interesting fact. And we will talk about it later on during our presentation. And here you can see Koreans at the graves of their beloved ones who are now gone at a typical Korean cemetery on the outskirts of Tashkent during the celebration of Hansik, or the Day of Cold Food, the day of commemoration of the dead, cleaning the graves and paying the respect. They also try to do it in a typical traditional Korean way, really trying to preserve the remains of that culture and their Koreanness that they have really strived to keep throughout generations. At the same time, the tragical story of this diaspora, the history and the drama of this diaspora, constantly on the go, being constantly uprooted, and the diaspora that left their original motherland in the search of a better place to call home, to move away again and again, and then being resettled again and again. So the drama and the history of these diasporas is at the same time very closely linked to the drama and the history of Korea, to the drama and the history of the Korean Peninsula. Throughout the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the colonization of Korea by Japan, when many Koreans had to leave Korea and move abroad. This is the time when precisely all these voluntary migrations started taking place, and the Koreans were moving and leaving their homes, going to Russia, going to the US, to Hawaii, even further to Mexico and Cuba. So this drama and this history is very closely connected with the history and drama of our Korean diaspora as well. And then throughout the 20th century, Second World War, and before that, the deportation and the forced resettlement, the deportation and the forced resettlement of our ethnic Koreans from Russia to Central Asia. And after that, the Second World War, and after the Second World War, the Cold War and the Korean War that split the Korean Peninsula in two halves and even increased the drama and the history of the Korean people. So all of that is actually, or should I say, the history of our Korean diaspora is part of this bigger history. And these questions that our Korean diaspora, the questions that our Koreans are constantly asking themselves, who are we? These questions are present until nowadays. Who are we? Where do we stand? Are we Koreans? Are we not? As you probably might know, our Korean diaspora in the former Soviet Union, they have lost their language throughout the time and the decades of their voluntary and forced movements. Our Koreans are native Russian speakers. They speak no Korean language as such. Their original Korean language, or Koryomal, the language of the Hamgyong dialect, the language of the Hamgyong province in North Korea, that they brought with themselves to northern Russia and then slowly Russified, and this is how it was turned into Koryomal. This language was almost lost throughout generations. So they were left as Russian speakers, but deeply saving their Korean nature and Korean souls. They also continuously kept asking themselves, are we Korean or are we not? As you probably might know also, all of our Koreans have been educated in the Soviet system of education. So we can say that our Koreans have Soviet or post-Soviet mentality, Russian mentality, Central Asian mentality. But at the same time, they strive to keep their Koreanness, the remains of their Korean culture, the remains of their Korean language. They call themselves Korean. They have Korean faces. In their passports, in all our post-Soviet passports, there is a point where it says nationality or ethnicity. It should say ethnicity because nationality actually means ethnicity. And there in their passports, the ethnicity is written as Koreans. So they are Koreans and they are not. And this constant search and this constant question, the search for the history of this diaspora and the search maybe for our own self-identification as a group, as a person on an individual basis. This is something that actually drove me to do the project Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story, which I will also talk with all of you in a little bit more detail. Basically, this project, it took me 2 years to accomplish this project. It took me 2 years. Sorry. Sorry.
Speak a bit more,
Yeah.
a bit louder.
Yes.
And the mic a bit further.
Okay, like that?
Yeah, try.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So it took me almost 2 years to accomplish this project. I started it in 2014 and wrote and filmed it throughout 2014-2015, and it was published in 2016 in the Diplomat in 3 parts. So basically, in this project, I was trying to look into our history and through my own personal and family history to discover and rediscover the history of our Korean diaspora, how it came, how it left Korea, and how it came from Korea to Russia and to Central Asia. So the first part talks about that, about my family roots, about my Korean grandfather, and about the voluntary migration of Koreans to Russia first, and then later forced resettlement or deportation of all ethnic Koreans to Central Asia. The second part actually describes all the details of the deportation itself and the personal narratives behind this deportation, as well as the conditions in which ethnic Koreans had to live and work in Uzbekistan after they had been resettled, how they came and had to dry the swamps and turn our land in Uzbekistan into fruitful land, build the first Korean farms, or later very famous Soviet Korean kolkhozes that actually became the best Korean farms or the best agricultural farms, not only in Uzbekistan or in Central Asia, but all over the Soviet Union. And this is how our Koreans really became famous for this labor through which they have redeemed themselves eventually in the eyes of the Soviet state. And the third part of my project talks about those Koreans who ended up not being deported to Central Asia and to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, mostly at the beginning, but those Koreans who ended up in the Siberian gulags because they were part of the Korean diaspora that lived in the Russian Far East, that was not deported kind of peacefully to Central Asia, if we can call it a peaceful resettlement, but they were purged and sent directly to the Siberian gulags. So the third part talks about them, about their personal stories, and also about those Koreans who in the course of the history ended up in North Korea again, participating in the Korean War, in the war between the North and the South, on the northern side, helping the newly formed North Korean regime and the Kim Il-sung government, under Kim Il-sung rule, to liberate, as they said, their land from the capitalist aggressors. So there were approximately 400, 600 Soviet Koreans, mostly from Central Asia, who actually formed later on the first government of the Kim Il-sung in the newly liberated North Korea. So my project also tells their stories. And there is another story about those Koreans, the Soviet Korean who entered the Forgotten War. It tells the story and the personal history of General Nam-il, who is well known as the North Korean general that signed the armistice and thus technically stopped the war in the Korean Peninsula. But actually very few people know that he himself was an Uzbekistani Korean and that his family was also deported to Uzbekistan in 1937. So this is where he comes from, and this is how he became famous in North Korea. But coming back to my project, originally what strove me to discover the history behind the deportation of ethnic Koreans to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in 1937 is partially my own family history. As you might have noticed, I have a Korean last name. My last name is Kim, and I had a Korean grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who was brought to Uzbekistan as a 6-year-old child. He was deported together with all of his family from the Far East to Uzbekistan, and he came on an infamous train journey, the deportation of all ethnic Koreans from the Far East. There were approximately 200,000 people put on those trains. It was a very hard journey that lasted almost 2 months. With almost no food and water in a very difficult conditions. And I learned all the details behind this history much later, but just on a personal level, as a child being brought up in a very small but very international family, because as you can see here, my Korean grandfather, he married, his wife was Russian, my grandmother is Russian, so he married a Russian woman, and my mom, here you can see her small child, he was half Korean, half Russian, and you can see her here in a kindergarten in Tashkent in the, I think these were late 1950s, early 1960s, as the only Korean looking child among all the blonde and blue-eyed Russian kids in Soviet Uzbekistan in Tashkent. And here they are all together with the relatives, both Korean and Russian relatives, enjoying the friendship of people in Tashkent. This is our Korean family who also lived on the Korean collective farm, Politodel, actually a very famous Korean collective farm. It was one of the richest and the best collective farms in Uzbekistan. So this is actually my Korean family. And coming back to my personal narrative, growing up in this small international family, seeing all of these Korean relatives around and being brought up and raised by my Korean grandfather, and just understanding his difference from the rest of us, and asking myself, how come my grandfather is Korean? So I once asked him, I was a small girl, maybe 6, 7 years old, so I asked him, Grandpa, how come you're Korean? And how come we have all these Korean people around at home, and we eat Korean food, and there are like so many Korean people on the streets in Tashkent, and have you always been here? And he actually got silent for a bit, and then he answered my naive, childish question. He said, no, you know, we haven't always been here. We were actually brought here on the train. All Korean people came here and were brought here on the train. And he, for some reason, maybe because I was small, maybe because he didn't want to remember that story. And this is what happens with most of our Koreans. They actually do not want to remember the details of those deportation, because they were very, very hard. He never told me more about that, but that story of those mysterious Koreans who came to my home country on a train, I think it ingrained into my mind back then. And since then I always kept this story, and I always wanted to tell this story. and to know more details behind the story myself. So this is what basically made me come back to this project already many years later as an adult. I always kept it somewhere in my mind and in my heart, trying to rediscover the history and the stories of the Korean people in my home country and bring them back to the light. And here you can see a picture of another character of my project, of my story, Lost and Found in Uzbekistan, the Korean story, Nikolai Ten. Through his family and actually through his personal history, I was able to show a bigger history behind the movement of the Korean people, first to Russia and then later deportation to Central Asia. So these are his parents, Galina Lee and Alexei Ten. Konstantin, Galina Lee and Konstantin Ten. Alexei Ten was his brother actually. So they met on the train while being deported to Uzbekistan, Galina Lee and Konstantin Ten. They were both deported with their parents, and they met after arriving to Uzbekistan on the infamous train, and this is where they formed their family, and this is where they bore their children, 4 children, and they worked on the collective farms in Uzbekistan, and this is where they lived and worked since then on. You can see Galina Lee, mother of Nikolai, in this picture. And I think I'll show you some videos from my project where all these people I just mentioned you will tell their narratives in a little bit more details about the deportation and about their life in Uzbekistan. And then maybe we will open the floor to discussion and we'll decide which areas you will be interested to discuss within the context of Korea-Saran and the deportation topic, of course. So let me switch this to the videos, and I'll show you the video interviews by my grandmother first, telling the history, our family history, and how she remembered the deportation of 1937 from my grandfather's stories. He unfortunately passed away in 2007, so we also lost our only Korean member in our family, but his memory I tried to keep in this project and in my work. Okay, hopefully it works.
Я Ким Лидия Леонидовна, русская, 1931 года рождения, а Ким фамилия по мужу. Мой муж Ким Дагир, кореец, с 1930 года рождения. Корейцев я вообще не видела, я встретила первого корейца, нашего дедулю. Мы, когда переехали в Ташкент, то здесь уже очень было много корейцев, очень много корейцев. В Средней Азии их очень было много. А я вот это не знала. Это потом, когда в процессе жизни стал возникать вопрос, а как же вы попали? И мне тогда дед сказал, что в 1937 году их вывезли, они были на границе, жили на границе. Он родился, значит, село Хандаус, Дальневосточный край. И вот когда была война с Японией, тогда была война, и их с этой границы убрали. С какой целью, я не знаю. И привезли вот сюда, в Среднюю Азию. Да, он мне это сказал, что мне было 7 лет, и я вообще, говорит, ничего не помню. Я помню, что нас вот выселили в степи, всех корейцев. И везде, говорит, нас в товарных вагонах даже. И я больше ничего, говорит, не помню.
Then I also have the interview of the survivor of the deportation. Let me, while the video is opening, I'll tell you a little bit more about him. His name is Valentin Shin, and he was...
Ну, разговоры такие были. тому времени готовилась война с Японией. И вот по обличию корейцы и японцы похожи. Чтобы не мешались они тут, вроде вывезли, да? А так на самом деле я не знаю, вот почему вывезли нас оттуда. И причем давали, по-моему, всего сутки на сборы. И в теплушку, и тут, сюда. И долго же ехали. Теплушка, знаешь, что такое? Это товарный вагон. Вот полочки сделали, чтобы нары, вернее, сделали. Люди внизу и на нарах. Это товарные вагоны, теплушками называли. Значит, чтобы люди не мерзли, в вагоне в середине буржуйки вот такие ставили. Это железные печки такие. И трубу выводили. Вот так. Говорят, больше месяца везли. Ну, сколько я точно не скажу. Ну, разговоры такие были, больше месяца везли. Везли. Тут тоже, наверное, не обошлось без потерь. Как обычно бывает у нас. И ведь даже тех, кто были на партийных работах, там же и партийные организации же были, партийные работники, все вот так куча, всех вместе.
He also Nikolai telling the story of his grandparents and parents.
Я помню по их рассказам, с вечером за ними пришли работники НКВД и дали полчаса на сбор, сказали взять с собой документы и продукты питания, предметы первой необходимости. Потом всех построили и посадили на товарный вагон и отправили в Узбекистан. По их рассказам, они где-то ехали в Узбекистан. Ну, там условия были очень тяжелые, потому что у многих еда кончилась, пить, воду давали не всегда. Особенно много умирало в пути. Это маленькие дети и старики, пожилые и старые женщины. Ну, моей мамы, родители сами почти ничего не кушали и не пили, они отдавали детям. И поэтому от истощения они умерли по пути. И времени не было хоронить их, и только охранники уже мертвых, их оставляли в сугробах возле железнодорожной насыпи. Мои родители, отец Тен Константин Васильевич, родился 12 октября 1917 года в городе Комсомольске-на-Амуре, Приморского края. Вместе с родителями, с отцом, матерью и 3 сыновьями в 1937 году были репрессированы и сосланы в Узбекистан, Верничечийский район, Таш-область. Моя мама, это Ли Галина Васильевна, родилась 25 декабря 1919 года в селе Крабы Приморского края. Она также была репрессирована в 1937 году и сослана в Узбекистан. Они приехали в Узбекистан, это где-то в Верничечийском районе. Им сказали обустраивайтесь. Здесь были болота, непроходимые камыши. И очень много было не тигров, а шакалов. И волки даже здесь обитали. Боялись, потому что они прям подходили к их домам. Вначале они жили специально в бараках и под охраной, чтобы никто не мог куда-то уйти. Их охраняли охранники специально вооруженные. Это солдаты. Они познакомились только в Узбекистане. Их в одно место всех привезли, и мои родители, как и все репрессивные корейцы, осушали болото, вырубали камыши. Это был очень тяжелый труд. Они жили в шалашах. Очень много было комаров. Люди болели малярией, и многие умирали, потому что не было лекарств. Но благодаря их героическому труду болота были осушены, камыши вырублены. И потом их попросили сажать рис на этих землях, чтобы прокормить себя и чтобы сдавать государству рис.
Корейского колхоза очень много было. Ну, было вот по Ташкентской области, вот это Верхнечистинский район, да, в Верхнечистинском районе были 6 колхозов было. 6 колхозов. Ну, из них 5 почти корейские были. И все 6 колхозах работали 6 председателей корейцы. Вот так вот. Вот Средний Чеченский район, там было тоже очень много. Тоже колхозов 5 было. Корейские колхозы, да, где корейцы в большей части проживали. Корейцы это трудолюбивый народ очень, так. Вот. Земледелием они занимались очень хорошо, вот, обеспечивали всегда, вот, развивались. Вот поэтому они такие были. Ну, хорошо, если работаешь, что получаешь больше урожая больше сдаешь, больше деньги поступают. Вот за счет этого они и колхозникам раздавали деньги, и, значит, оставалось деньги для развития. Вот. Вот так вот они развивались. Рис. Вот, рис. Потом, значит, стали выращивать хлопок. Вот. Потом, значит, стали выращивать кенаф. Кенаф в основном стали выращивать Верхний Чеченский район и Нижний Чеченский район. Нижний Чеченский район кенаф. Это в основном были кенафосеющие районы. Вот за счет кенафу вот, стало столько много героев соцтруда, получали большие урожаи. Вот. Ну, это было 48 до 52 года.
Корейцы в основном рисом занимались. Ну, в общем, и сахарной свеклой занимались. И нас, маленьких, посылали убирать эту свеклу. А вот на пшеничных полях жучков ловили. Иначе они портили весь посев. Вот так. Потом, когда мы подросли в школе немного, на хлопок стали посылать. И иногда директор сам нас мобилизует и давай. Ну, жилья-то там нету, собирать хлопок, это осенью, тепло еще. Кто как устраивался там, собирали тоже.
Отразилось то, что вот как их привезли в Советский Союз, они вроде бы как их оставили, и они вот это сами своим трудом и организовывали все. И поэтому у них колхозы были закрыты, в колхозах корейцы только жили. Никого туда они не пускали, и никто туда носа не сунул. Это только были типично закрытые корейские колхозы. А это уже было уже в старости. И я говорю: дед, а вот почему? Вы же вот в колхозы корейские, никто туда носа не мог сунуть, говорю. Там столько все корейское, только все национальное. Вот. А почему, я говорю, там не селились ни узбеки, ни русские? Вот. А он мне сказал: а ты что думаешь, вот как нас бросили, говорит, в степи? Это мы же сами все своим трудом добились. Ну так, он мне сказал.
Я родился в 50-м году. Я помню, знаете, начиная с 3 лет, с 53-го года, я все это помню, что 53-й год меня на улицу отправляли, чтобы я следил. У мамы была машинка Зингер, и она шила на заказ платье. А я выходил на улицу и следил, потому что мама боялась налоговый инспектор. Если незнакомый появлялся, не кореец, я бежал домой и кричал: инспектор, инспектор. И мама прятала машинку, потому что это было строго запрещено заниматься надомной работой. За это нужно было налог платить. А мама по ночам, она шила по ночам, потому что днем, она занималась своим хозяйством, корову, там, живность, только по ночам, почти не спала и ночью шила. Я помню, что одно, мне говорили, что меня от груди оторвали, когда мне 1 года не было. Я в основном коровье молоко пил. Мама все время работала, по ночам молоко пропало. Я же, знаете, что помню. Хлеба я не видел до примерно 5 лет. В основном жмых мы кушали. И сахар я тоже не видел. В основном мампаси конфеты были, вот такие леденцы круглые. Вот это мы кушали. Это, знаете, вот эти отходы, как вам сказать, кукуруза, там разная все смесь. Я помню, он такой грубый хлеб, да, его очень тяжело кушать был. А потом после него немножко живот болел. Когда много поешь его. Я первый раз хлеб в 55-м году, в 5 лет попробовал. Да, дефицит был, хлеба не было. Тяжелые времена, вот знаете, начало 50-х годов. Потому что рис, например, что выращивал в колхозе, колхозники все сдавали государству. Потому что нельзя было брать, если поймали бы кто-то рис, забрал себе, за это осудили бы на длительный срок.
Как-то люди стремились выжить. И в основной массе, конечно, выжили здесь, с трудом выжили. Нас привезли сюда, это мы, наверное, первые переселенцы в Советском Союзе. Потом в годы войны сюда завезли с запада. Переселили людей, где шла война оттуда. В том числе и русские, и евреи, и белорусы, украинцы, всякие тут были. 42-й, 43-й эти годы, тяжелые годы, 44-й. Мы до 47-го года с трудом здесь. После войны тоже трудные годы были. И кроме всего прочего, еще вот что. И ведь корейцы любят траву, зелень. Слушай, в Узбекистане этой травы навалом было. Так что этой травы много мы поели. Сейчас уже нету столько травы. что сказать. Раз выжили, значит все нормально. Это самое главное. Да, корейцев много здесь похоронено. Полное кладбище там. Ну, времени сколько прошло? 37-го года, слушай. Это сколько лет прошло? Даже в 37 году родился человек. А еще, если там в России родился, значит, еще прибавь, да? И вот так вот. Вот завтра как раз родительский день. 5 апреля на кладбище везде будут корейцы. Вот завтра обязательно поминание. Этот день такой, и могилу чистят, и приводят в порядок там. И потом, значит, еду обрядную ставят там, посидишь там. Порядок такой. Если вот люди поминают, да, расстелят там, еду привезли там и так далее. Если кто-то посторонний придет, то даже радуются люди, давай, садись с нами вместе.
Yes, I think I will stop here because I have many more videos that you can watch them in my project because it's all published online. And I wanted to discuss actually with you all together because this whole topic of the deportation is so big and overwhelming, and there are several parts or chapters in the history of how Koreans came to Russia voluntarily before being deported. Then how about the deportation itself we already talked, and you watched the video, maybe you have questions or feedback. And then also how these Koreans lived on this and worked on these ethnically Korean collective farms in Central Asia. It's also a very big topic. And then also how actually their self-identification movement started in the early 1980s. It's also a very big topic. So I don't want to stick to one topic myself, but I would rather maybe open the floor to the questions. And then all together, I'm sure we'll be able to discover these parts of the history of how Koreans came to Central Asia. So maybe if you want to ask questions or comment or tell me which area you would like me to focus on, so please, I will open the floor now.
Yeah, can you speak to the question of why they were deported in the first place? Because we heard various opinions behind the deportation in the videos, but what is your opinion from your research?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Thank you very much. And there were actually several reasons behind the deportation of ethnic Koreans to Central Asia from the Far East. And as you can see here, the map of deportations. This is the map of deportations or first relocations of all, not all, but many ethnic minorities within the Soviet Union. Basically, over 40 of them have been forcefully relocated or deported in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and throughout as far as late 1940s. And the deportation of Koreans, it's actually the longest arrow on the map, from all the way from the Far East to Central Asia. And there were several reasons behind this deportation. And actually, let me show you, I have a map. So this is where Koreans lived before being deported in the Far East. And let me show you this map, which I think is very important in order to answer this question. Actually, the reasons behind this deportation lie in a very complicated geopolitical situation in that region during that time. And we have here to remember the role of Japan in the geopolitical history of that whole area. First of all, the first Sino-Japanese wars at the end of the 19th century, when Japan started accruing territories within China on the border, very close from Korea and Russia, and then colonizing Korea in 1905, and then Korea became a Japanese protectorate in 1905, and then in 1910 it officially became a Japanese colony. And this is also when the outflow of ethnic Koreans really started taking place, the biggest outflow of ethnic Koreans from Korea to Russia. And then later, the Mukden incident and the creation of Manchukuo, or Japanese puppet state, in between Russia, China, and Korea. So Japan has been aggressively moving toward acquiring more and more territories, both in China and on the border with Russia. So this threat of basically Japanese military involvement was always present during that time within that region. And we also shouldn't forget that in 1905, back in 1905, Russia lost the war with Japan. So it was the first time when the Western power actually lost the war to the Eastern power, militarizing Eastern power. So since then, actually, Russian government started being very, very cautious toward ethnic Koreans that were already living in the Far East on the Russian territory, populating it. They owned land, many of them were Russian citizens. So this is when the Russian government actually starts taking away their lands and starts looking at them suspiciously, because since then Russian government starts recognizing these Koreans somehow as the Japanese subjects. And this is also how Japan was recognizing Koreans as its own subject since back in 1905 when Korea became Japanese colony. Even though ethnic Koreans, Russian Koreans and then Soviet Koreans, because also during that time the revolution of 1917 takes place and Russia becomes Soviet Union. So even though Soviet Koreans, they always kept loyalty to the Soviet state, because first and foremost, many of them, most of them actually, who moved to the Russian territory back then, were members of the liberation movement. And many of them were also poor peasants and middle class who wanted better lives, but actually many and most of them were also members of the liberation movement. They wanted to liberate Korea from the Japanese occupation. So they actually considered Japan as their enemy, and they were loyal to the Soviet state. They also fought side by side and shoulder to shoulder with the Soviet state during the civil war in the Far East throughout 1920s, 1917, 1922, when the civil war took place in the Far East. They were the ones who actually helped the Soviets get back those territories from Japan. So they always had been loyal, but that threat of them somehow cooperating with Japan and colliding with Japan and helping Japan and becoming Japanese subject was always present in the eyes of the Russian and Soviet government, and they were also afraid to lose those territories, always. So those plans to deport ethnic Koreans, they actually start as early as after the Civil War, so in the early 1920s. And they take place, the deportation takes place in 1937. This is also when the Second World War is approaching, and this is very important, another very important historical fact is the fact that this is when Japan invades China also, in 1937. So it actually starts invading those territories. So this is when the Soviet government finally decides we have to deport ethnic Koreans, being afraid that they would side with the Japanese, and also Japan, since Korea was its colony, it was using its subjects and sending its spies to mingle among the ethnic Koreans in the Far East. So this is another reason why they got deported. So the threat of them siding with the Japanese government, ethnic Korean Japanese spies in those territories, and also the fact that the Koreans, they not only wanted to liberate their original historical motherland, but they also wanted to create an independent republic. After they helped the Soviet government win the civil war in the Far East, that Far Eastern territory had been very shortly previously occupied by the Japanese, actually. So they got it back and they wanted to have an autonomous republic, because this is when, in the late 1920s, some ethnicities in the Soviet Union, they were allowed to have autonomous republics. Like, for instance, Volga Germans, they had their own autonomous republic back then, and then there was also a Jewish republic near Birobidzhan. So Koreans also wanted an independent territory for themselves. So this is when the Soviet government also starts thinking that that independent republic also could side with Japan at some point, maybe. So this is one of the political reasons and theories behind the deportation. And then there is also one economic reason. Some people say that it was not true and it's only rumors. The same thing is sometimes being talked about, the political reasons. But one very important economic reason is during that short time while the Far Eastern Republic was under the Japanese rule, actually Koreans started producing rice massively. And the production of rice in those lands, which were completely unfit for agricultural purposes, it increased like 1,000-fold. So this is when both the Japanese government, which needed agricultural supplies for their state and for the military, and the Soviet government also understand that those Koreans were actually capable to produce agricultural resources on the land which was completely unfit for agriculture. And they sent them to Central Asia, which they effectively developed in less than 5 years. In Uzbekistan, they dried the swamps. In Kazakhstan, these were steppes, dry steppes. But in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, in less than 5 years, they were actually able to grow incredible crops of rice, cotton, and jute. So actually, that was the economic reason behind the deportation.
Yeah,
Yes.
all right.
Ask you about the political. So,
Yeah.
did Japan ever claim the Koreans? Did Japan ever claim the Koreans?
Yes.
In the Primordial in Russia as their own citizens?
Well, they always consider themselves as their own citizens, and as far as I read and researched, they were the only government that actually claimed, when the Soviet government was deporting Koreans, Japan was the only country that actually raised the concern, and they were the only government that said, these Koreans are our subjects and you cannot deport them, like you cannot move them, you cannot resettle them. But no other country protested or reacted anyhow. But Japanese government, I think officially, they were trying to claim that Koreans were their subject and they couldn't be deported from the Far East.
There could be another view.
By the way, I have distinguished professors here in the audience, so you are all welcome to help me.
I don't know. But in 24, Japan outlawed dual citizenship. So Japanese in America and Brazil, they could not be Japanese citizens. So they weren't claiming. This is a Russian point of view. The Russian tells them what it's doing. This is why we had to report you. Japan could not claim it. They didn't. There were 4 times, 5 times more Koreans in what you guys say, Chosun. But Chinese Koreans. Yeah, Chinese Koreans. There's 5 times more. They were never claimed by Japan because it wasn't legal. I'm just saying. And maybe we should talk about the loyalty of the Soviet Koreans. In the 1929 war against Japan, they used Soviet Koreans. Recruitment of Soviet Koreans in KGB, which was in KGB, started in 1920. And there was so many secret agents that they were sending into Manchuria. So the loyalties are well known. The ones in Russia. As far as my...
This is, by the way, John Chan, who wrote the book. Please tell me the title of your book correctly. I under the sun.
Right, burned by the sun.
Burned by the sun.
So I'm American. I went to Central Asia for about 5 years. I especially looked for Koreans, Chinese. They were deported too. They all worked for NKVD. And everybody that helped deport the Koreans were their own people. And then they usually, the collective farm leaders were informants for the state. So then you name the good people, then the bad, disappear.
John Chang has spent over 6 years also doing field work in Central Asia and interviewing many Koreans. So it's an honor to have you here, and thank you very much for your feedback. Any more questions? Yes?
Thank you. As far as I understand, there was prior to the ethnic relocation of Korean during this time period, there was ethnic relationship between Mahan culture, it's a Korean culture, with the Kazakhstan culture during in the time period of 4th century, 5th century, and how is the Mago culture is related historically with Kazakhstan culture?
That's a very good, very complicated question. To be honest, I don't know if I will be able to answer your question. If anyone does know from the audience, I will be grateful. But I know, maybe, I don't know if it's a relevant answer, but what I know also that there were some Koreans living in Kazakhstan before the deportation. This is a well-known fact. There were very few Koreans that they were not deported in 1937. The majority of Koreans came in 1937. So they deported 200,000 people. Over 100,000, like roughly over half of them they brought to Kazakhstan and the other half to Uzbekistan. But yes, there are records that before that there were Koreans living in Kazakhstan. Very
migration.
few. Yes, ethnic migration, but they were really very few. And but they moved voluntarily. I think these were, as you correctly mentioned, they were long relationships dating back to the Silk Road and trade and history, and they may be nomads. They were also nomads, so they were resettled and brought to Kazakhstan. So this is true. Yeah. Thank you for a very good question. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is a totally layman question. I don't know much about this at all. But before the deportation, you said they came from Smirsk, which is around Vladivostok, I guess.
Yes.
And also, I've had students, many students who are ethnic Korean from Sakhalin also. Why did they leave Korea originally, or when, or was there a big exodus then, before that, when they left to go to the Far East?
Yes, these two are very good questions, and I will be more than happy to answer both of them. So these are two different diasporas within the Korean diasporas in the former Soviet Union. So Koryo-Saram are the Soviet or post-Soviet Koreans now, as we call them, that voluntarily migrated to the Far East, to the Russian Far East from ancient Korea, Korea, while it still was one unified country. And most of them, they were mostly from Hamgyong province. Now in North Korea, I think there are two provinces, North and South Hamgyong. Back then it was one Hamgyong province, so most of Koryo-Saram come from there. And their language, Koryo-Mali, is also a Hamgyong dialect. So I will maybe talk about them first, and then afterwards briefly about the Sakhalin Koreans, because it's a different diaspora, they have a different history. So, as you can see here, this is the Far East, Russian Far East. This is where most of Koreans lived. Actually, at the very bottom of this region, near Vladivostok and below Slavyanka, Posyet, Hassan. So this is where they were moving, and shortly before the deportation in the 1920s, this is where the Korean National District of Posyet was formed. So there were approximately 200,000 Koreans, and they unified all the ethnic Korean villages in that Korean National District of Posyet. So this is where they lived. And Koreans, they started migrating to northern Russia in the second half of the 19th century, so in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And here it's very important to remember 1860, the Treaty of Beijing signed between, the Treaty of Peking, I think, signed between the Qing dynasty, the last Chinese dynasty, and the Russian Tsar's government. So you can see on this map Inner Manchuria in red and Outer Manchuria in pink. So the outer part of Outer Manchuria in pink on top. So these parts used to be part of the Qing dynasty's China. So by the Peking Treaty of 1860, they became Russian territory. And you can see here a tiny, tiny border, again near Vladivostok, between North Korea and that Russian territory of Outer Manchuria, regional Outer Manchuria. So this is where Koreans had been migrating in the 1850s. So they started migrating first into the Chinese Qing dynasty territories, but then this territory became Russian in 1860, and this is when Russian government sends its army there, and this is when they discover the first Korean families, the first 13 Korean families along the Tizinhe River back there. But by then they say that there had been actually about 3,000 Koreans living there, but this is when they officially discovered them for the first time. So back then, this newly acquired land was completely, how to say, it was undeveloped, it was new, so they actually needed people to develop that land. So this is when they welcomed the immigration from Korea. And they sent also people from Western Russia, mostly Cossacks and the army and the soldiers. But since Koreans, again, it's an irony, because Koreans, they really always have been such hard working in agriculture. They really was so successful in agriculture. So they let Koreans develop those land. And back then, since there were almost no people, they were actually giving away huge amounts of land to those people who were willing to settle there. And this is how Koreans, poor peasants from the Hamgyong province that always suffered from very bad geography, very bad climatic conditions, very poor economic conditions. Also, we shouldn't forget the history of feudal Korea back then, which was a completely run-down state. And they had huge taxes on the peasants, so peasants were practically starving. They really had a desperate life. So they were running anywhere where they could get better living. And then Russian government offered citizens, offered land. So this is when they started moving. But then, back then also Russia and Korea, they didn't have any diplomatic relationship. So they established diplomatic relationship much later in 1884, around 1884. So this is when Korea actually asked Russian government not to let Koreans in, because Korean government never really liked the idea of its subject running away or escaping. So this is when they asked Russian government officially stop the Korean migration, and the Russian government slowly also, I think maybe even for economic and political purposes, started curbing down the migration. So they stopped giving, at some point they stopped giving passports, they stopped giving land, but they already had been Koreans living there, they became rich, they were Russian citizens, they were trying also bringing their families, and they needed people basically to work on those lands. So now richer Koreans, they were asking like the remains of their families, and they were attracting poor Koreans to come and work illegally in Russia, developing those farms. So this is when also Korean migration intensifies. And then, as I already mentioned, when Korea becomes Japanese colony in the early 20th century, this is when Koreans start massively running away, flowing into the Russian territory, again for economic reasons, political reasons, and also as part of the movement, liberation movement. So I think this answers your part of the question about Russian Korea. And the Sakhalin diaspora is actually a different Korean diaspora, because Sakhalin Island used to be Japanese territory, all Sakhalin Island. So when I think it was during already the Second World War, actually Japan was bringing ethnic Koreans, because those Russian Koreans, let's call them Russian Koreans for the moment, they were mostly from the north. But Japan was bringing Koreans mostly from the south to work, because they needed labor again on the Sakhalin Island. So this is when Sakhalin Island starts being populated by Koreans, by ethnic Koreans from the south. And throughout the Second World War, they are there as Japanese subject because it was Japanese territory, and then the war ends, and Japan, as part of the Allies, loses the Second World War together with the Nazi Germany, and they divide Sakhalin Islands. So in 1947, part of the Sakhalin Island becomes Soviet territory, and those diaspora just get stuck without papers because they were Korean, but they were Japanese, and they belonged to the enemy, but they could not take them back, and they actually stayed in a limbo for a very long time. And then slowly some of them were able to, but very few of them were able to return. And I think even now they have programs in Japan, I think, for the repatriation of this original Sakhalin Koreans. But most of them eventually, actually similarly to our Koryosaran Koreans who also had been without paperwork, they were actually for some time they were without identification. They didn't have passport, didn't have paperwork. And then slowly, after the policy change in the 1950s, they received Soviet citizenship. So they all became Soviet citizens. Actually, in the case of Sakhalin Koreans by force, because they didn't really want, like comparing the loyalty, they didn't have the loyalty to the Soviet state our Koreans had, but I mean they were forced to become Soviet citizens, and also they're different diaspora, because Sakhalin Koreans is the mix of Japanese and Russian diaspora, and our Koreans are the mix of Central Asian and Russian diaspora, and also South Korean for Sakhalin Koreans and North Korean for Koryosaran. More? Yes. Yes?
You mentioned right at the start that the Korean language had virtually disappeared from these diaspora communities. For that to happen that quickly, one assumes there was no provision of education for the Korean children who arrived in 1937. But were there any efforts at any time to kind of, amongst the communities, to keep the language alive, or was that simply not feasible in the political situation at the time?
It's a very good question, thank you very much. Yes, basically, Koreans always try to preserve their language Koreomari, the mix of Koreomar, the mix of Northern Hamgyong dialect with some Russian words. They try to preserve it from the very beginning. They always try to have Korean language schools, Korean language theater, Korean language newspaper, Korean language art. And for some periods of time, like in the late 1920s, for instance, or even before that in Russia, in the Tsar's Russia, they were allowed to have Korean language schooling and education, and also for some time in the 1920s. But then afterwards, especially shortly before and after the deportation, and because of Stalinist policies and the policies in the Soviet Union later on, they did not allow ethnic minorities to develop their own languages. I mean, the preference in the Soviet state was always for Russian language, and Russian language was always the official language of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet personality was like Homo Sovieticus was always a Russian-speaking one. So at some point they actually closed Korean language schools, like they could not have Korean language schools, but they kept Korean, for instance, in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, they kept Korean language theater throughout all of this time. And this theater also served for propaganda purposes, of course, because they had plays like, it's very interesting, you can find the documentaries, afterwards I can recommend you some documentaries if you want on YouTube, where you can see what kind of plays they actually performed in that theater in Kazakhstan. It's even similar a little bit with North Korea in terms of propaganda, because this is the propaganda of the Soviet state and how they all live friendly under Stalin, but in Korean. And so that theater, it existed throughout all of the time, and they were actually wearing also Korean traditional clothes. So in one way, this is where they could exercise, some of their culture, wear Korean clothes and speak Korean. But again, it was always, let's say so, closely observed and programmed and censored by the Soviet state. And in a similar way, they also always had the Korean language newspaper, Lenin Kichi. I actually have some pictures here of some later times in the 1980s. Yes, I think this, when they start kind of celebrating, when the Koreans were already allowed to have their own kind of ethnic celebrations. the first celebration they were allowed to have, kind of celebrating their Koreanness, like a Korean festival, in the late 1980s. It was already after the free speech was allowed by Gorbachev and after the glasnost and perestroika. Still, even the first celebration, they had to make it a celebration on the Korean language newspaper Lenin Kichi. Like they could just have Korean celebration as such. And this newspaper was very famous, and it was the major Korean language newspaper of all ethnic Koreans in the Soviet Union. It still exists. They only changed it actually to Russian language after the independence in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They kept it in Korean throughout all of the time. Actually have archives also of this newspaper in Korean. And they used this newspaper mostly for finding their relatives, especially after the deportation. People were posting, announcements, trying to find their family members there, and trying to get in touch. So this newspaper existed in Korean throughout all of this time. And then after the independence, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, they started having their own Russian language newspapers that based on that newspaper. So they could keep, scarce remains of their language and culture through that media controlled by the state.
I went to Kazakhstan in September to have a special concert with regard to 80 years of deportation. So that's why I was interested in this lecture. My question is, I heard there's a Korean village in Korea around Gwangju and Ansan, and maybe 10,000 more people are living in Korea. So I heard maybe around 10,000 people got Korean nationality and Korean citizens. And I haven't studied yet about these things, so because of why they wanted to come back to Korea. Yeah, that's my question. Is that economical or financial reason, or they just wanted to come back to Korea?
It's a very, very good question, thank you. It's very also, as all of these amazing questions, very difficult to answer simply to this question. First of all, I'll start with a small introduction. Basically, Koreans, they always lived in a certain cultural vacuum throughout the Soviet history. So they only start at the first contact with the Korean culture from the Korean peninsula starts in the late 1980s. So this is when they're allowed to kind of reclaim back their Koreanness. And I'll show you very briefly some pictures from that first festivities, ethnic Korean festivities of the Lenin Kichi newspaper, let's say so, honoring the Lenin Kichi newspaper. You can see that Koreans here are wearing Korean national costumes, and all Koreans happily gathered together in Tashkent and first singing the Korean songs. They didn't even know, dancing, and you can clearly see how these people emotionally related to getting back the Korean culture. But the very interesting thing is it was brought to them by North Korea first, at the end of the Soviet times. So North Korea contacted Soviet Koreans in the late 1980s first and brought them back Korean language schools and their culture and traditions. Surprisingly free of propaganda somehow, because maybe they had similar regime and propaganda, so they didn't need to share that, but they shared actually genuinely the Korean culture with these Koreans. After the independence, when Soviet Union ceased to exist and collapsed and was not supporting North Korea any longer, it was of course South Korea that established diplomatic relationship with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the rest of Central Asia, and took the role of, let's say so, supportive, we can say so, and of the Korean state, of the Korean country, I would say, of Korea, of that Korea that was introducing Korean culture and language and everything back to our Koreans. And of course, it's here, you have to understand that the relationship was always difficult also for our Koreans, because our Koreans, for instance, they are all mostly Russian speakers, right? They did not speak Korean language as such. They didn't really have the same culture with Korea. So I think in your question, answering the question, these are both emotional reasons and economical reasons. I think maybe mutually it has become a relationship of distant relatives. I even had actually a friend or acquaintance somehow from South Korea who described our Koreans as distant cousins. And culturally, I think for younger generations it's been much easier to adapt and learn the language, learn the classical Seoul dialect, and accommodate and assimilate in the Korean culture. And there are like young Koreans who go to South Korea to work and study. At the same time, of course, South Korea has become a very rich and economically developed country, and our countries have been somehow backward economically for many years. And of course, there are also economic opportunities. A lot of Koreans, they try to go to South Korea, besides all their maybe emotional and cultural reasons, simply to find work, because they can find better work, better jobs, they are better paid, and also there are mutual relationship actually between South Korea and our government. They even open from time to time like immigration lines, and they give visas, work visas, mostly actually for work. Because I think mutually also, I don't want to make any statements there or any critical statements, but I think it's also actually maybe convenient to have our Koreans as a sort of labor force, and temporary labor force. But I wouldn't like to kind of deviate, this conversation to that kind of political discussion. But I think it's mutually, for South Korea maybe it's convenient to have our Koreans as labor force, and for our Koreans it's convenient to go there temporarily, work, earn money and come back. Because again, whereas young Korean, they prefer to stay, like they study, they work, they assimilate and they stay. The older generations, I think they understand that it's not the same, and their home, their culture is in their countries, in Central Asia, the former Soviet Union. And this really became their one and only home.
Okay, one last question.
Yes.
The mass deportation of ethnic Koreans in 1937 to Central Asia is very inhumane action taken by the Soviet government. I wonder whether the Soviet government had ever officially apologized for this action.
The Russian government did apologize in the early 1990s.
To the
ethnic Koreans, yes, to ethnic Koreans. But this is also, it's a very good question, thank you very much. And the answer also is not easy, as always, because the Soviet government did this, and afterwards Soviet Union actually collapsed, and this became independent countries like Russia and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And the Russian government did apologize on behalf of the Soviet government. But I think the apology was, I'm not sure actually, only to the Russian Koreans, but mostly to the Russian Koreans. As for our Koreans, Uzbek Koreans and Kazakh Koreans, that whole topic of deportation still stays very, very complex and very complicated. Even before that, during Soviet time, it's been secret. Like they were moving, like they brought Koreans to Central Asia, but this whole information has been classified. And throughout most of their lifetime in the Soviet Union, they were not allowed to talk about it, raise that issue, and even people didn't know. Like most of our people, actually, this is one of the reasons that I did this project, hoping that our own people would learn why Korean and how Koreans came to our countries. Because most of people actually don't know very well all the details behind the deportation, because that information had been classified until late 1980s. Then the archives were briefly opened in the late 1990s, and this is when the apology was issued, and this is when actually they were accepting the fact that that deportation was inhumane, and, as you say, everything you said very correctly. But then, after some time, the archives were closed again. And now, actually, this is also something I wished maybe to talk during this talk. We are running out of time, but I'll briefly mention it. That whole rethinking and rewriting of history is taking place right now, and the whole issue of deportation has always been very complex in our countries and in our former Soviet space, because it's very difficult to accept something that had been done, and slowly the deportation started being called again resettlement, arrival, living, and for some time And even now, like we call it different names, and people also, I cannot say they celebrate, but they commemorate deportation, but they commemorate it as settling or resettling or living, living in or arriving in Central Asian Uzbekistan. So we need more time maybe to reconsider the past and accept the past. It's not an easy task, and this is a complex process that still that hasn't been finished. So we still actually have a lot of work to do in this regard in all our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much.